to a couple of days ago, we had been receiving a series of news and announcements for the upcoming patch 11.1 and the upcoming new season. So, of course, one of those announcements also included the addition of the brand new dungeon Operation Floodgate. What is perhaps the unique thing about this dungeon is that our previous 3 expansions worth of new dungeons added after the beginning of the expansion were actually kept in their Mythic 0 version for the first season, and we had to wait the season after that for those dungeons to turn into Mythic Plus, whereas now in Season 1 we will be getting a new dungeon and then immediately have that dungeon available in Mythic Plus. However, as you know, the War Within released with 8 dungeons, 4 of them have been made available in Mythic Plus from the start, and the other 4, at this point kind of forgotten this season, will become the dungeons in the pool of Mythic Plus. So Cinderbrew Meadery, Darkflame Cleft, the Rookery and Priory. Because patch 11.1 is also a Goblin themed patch, they also already announced that the Motherlode was going to come back from Battle of Azeroth, being of course a Goblin themed dungeon as well. So we knew already that we had the 4 dungeons from the War Within, the Motherlode and the brand new dungeon Operation Floodgate as the 6 out of 8 of the dungeons that will make part of next season. So of course there were still 2 missing. Now, a couple of days ago we had an interview from Buffed, a German gaming news site which had been for years making interviews with WoW game developers, having one with Ion Azikostas, our supreme leader of WoW. And while initially Ion gave out a PR answer to the question about the 2 remaining dungeons for next season pool in Mythic Plus, he actually, after making sure himself that he could spoil the names of those dungeons, he apparently did, and the dungeons' names are Theater of Pain and Mechagon Workshop. Now, since it's been 2 days and we have gotten no denial whatsoever from Ion or from Blizzard about this interview announcing these 2 dungeons, we can only assume it seems to be true. So before talking about the entire pool for Season 2 of Mythic Plus as a whole, let's talk about why players are having problems with these 2 dungeons being announced. Starting from Mechagon Workshop. Now, Mechagon Workshop wasn't a bad dungeon by itself. It was enjoyed by quite a few players, not really considered one of the more annoying ones. It's also quite straightforward and reasonably fast in terms of number of pools, in terms of length of the dungeon. Even the bosses weren't particularly unreasonable. There wasn't a lot of PTSD about horrifying stories about these bosses in Workshop. What players found problems with this dungeon is the fact that if it were to come out in the War Within, we would now have gone 3 out of 4 expansions with this dungeon in the pool of Mythic Plus. You had this in, of course, when it was released in Battle for Azeroth. This came back in Season 4 of Shadowlands, when Blizzard's first, funny season at the end of the expansion was to bring back all of the mega dungeons in one Mythic Plus pool, and then it went missing in Dragonflight, only to come back again in the War Within. So it's a 3 out of 4 for just 1 dungeon, which seems a little bit excessive. For how good, for how nice the dungeon overall is, having this coming back every time might start to feel a little bit boring. But, perhaps players didn't play in BFA, they might not have played in Shadowlands, maybe they weren't playing Mythic Plus in Shadowlands or BFAs, so, between the dungeon being kind of good by itself and these kind of players not even having tried the dungeon to begin with, it's not that bad of an addition, if you can get past the annoyance of the repetition of the dungeon coming back in this expansion as well. Where players had way more problems is with Theater of Pain. It's also a very good example and very good proof of how much difference can there be between players who did play Mythic Plus at a reasonable level compared to players who just went in there very casual, low level keys. Many of these players seem to have no problem with Theater of Pain. It's a chill key, it's a fun key. I had fun going through Theater of Pain, no problems whatsoever. And then you have all of the rest of the player base who actually got PTSD trying to go through this hellhole. You know, many players, for example, would tell you about the horrors and nightmares of trying to deal with Koltarok because of how difficult it was, how much damage it used to do, especially because it used to force you to either have a priest in order to mass dispel the double magic dot it would put on players, because back then mass dispel still had a short cooldown, or a warlock to have the second dispel, kind of like the last boss in Siege of Boralus. However, the only reason why most of them would be complaining about him is because most of their keys would get depleted here. So they wouldn't even get the chance to see something even worse, which was Zav, the Unfallen. This was one of the earlier examples since Shadowlands about the scaling of Mythic Plus keys, where mechanics started doing so much damage that one-shots became practically the norm. You know, this boss with his mega AoE once he jumps in the middle was just simply killing players. And the boss had basically no other mechanic. You know, dodge the cleave, dodge the frontal, do the PvP minigame between two of the DPS, and then just survive the big AoE. Rinse and repeat for like 7 minutes. This dungeon was also thought to be horrible by many players, especially if you consider most of the time specs will become meta in Mythic Plus, have very good AoE, turbo AoE, cleave, multiple targets, and not really that good in single target, but the entire dungeon was the least target count dungeon in the expansion and possibly in the game. The amount of pools, the amount of targets you would fight each pool was very, very small. This was a 3-target pool, and each and every one of these mini bosses would kill one or the other, so you were fighting one, and then one, big pool, and then one, and then boss. And then you have to go through the worst wing of the entire dungeon, where the amount of pools were, again, 1, here you had 2, here you had the big guy in the middle, or again the big guy in the middle, here you have 2, here you have 3. So you had no satisfaction in making big, huge pools, except for practically just a couple of them, right at the beginning of the Plague Quarter and possibly right at the end of it. And that's it. The rest is 1 or 2 or 3 targets, plus the bosses were exceedingly annoying and scaled very poorly the higher you went in key level. Not to mention, back then it was 1 week of Tyrannical or 1 week of Fortified, so at least in Fortified you kind of somewhat were able to go through Theater of Pain. Not this time, not in the War Within, where Tyrannical and Fortified are already cooked in the keys once you start getting high enough. So this has now created some worries, some more than some worries, with the player base who was already kind of getting spooked at the current dungeons in Mythic Plus, that we can, you know, start awaiting for the next season in the War Within. Because players going through Heroic and getting a taste of the easy version of Dark Flame Cleft, of the Rookery, of Priory, and of Cinderbrew Meadery are not having too many good things to say. Perhaps the one that gets away the best out of all of this might be the Rookery. Lots of target density, lots of big pools, only 3 bosses, they kind of get away with it. But the other dungeons have triggered many players already, and they haven't even been doing them in Mythic Plus, like having an entire wing in Meadery where you are practically nearly permaslowed constantly if you don't get your interrupts right, and very annoying trash mobs. Lovely, I can already see it. You know, if you're already used nowadays to seeing groups pulling the first 3 or 4 packs of dungeons like Grim Battle or dungeons like the Stone Vault, instantly dying, breaking the key and leaving, wait until you get into Cinderbrew Meadery and try to do the first room of the first boss. And what's gonna happen there. Talking about mob density and lots of stuff to pay attention to, you have Priory of the Sacred Flame, which is not that much better in that regard. So in terms of the dungeons we already have in the expansion, things were already kind of iffy. And now you have the addition of Theater of Pain to this list. The addition of the Motherlode was okay. Players traditionally liked Motherlode. Motherlode is considered a pretty good dungeon overall, so it's kind of nice. However, with the 4 we already have, plus Theater of Pain, the returning of a dungeon which at this point you will see now in 3 expansion out of 4, and possibly, of course we don't know it yet, but possibly a terrible newly added dungeon, this has made players a little bit worried about the quality of the dungeons they will have to go through in Season 2 of the War Within, because this current season many players would arguably, even after having to try to do these dungeons in +10, +11, +12. So actually seeing them in Mythic Plus, actually seeing the difficulty once it scales harder, once it has all of the affixes on, even then most players would consider, for example, Arakara a better dungeon than Priory. They would consider the Dawnbreaker minus the 47 bugs a better dungeon than Cinderbrew Meadery, and the Stonevault a better dungeon than this abomination of a dungeon. Perhaps the only one that is maybe 50-50 would be City of Threads versus the Rookery. So already the perception of the player base is that the dungeons we have now in the season are actually better than what we're about to get. And things will get worse in Season 2. And then on top of that, you add Theater of Pain, which is a pretty badly received dungeon, also currently would be the longest of the dungeons, since we have gone down in this season to have a timer in Mythic Plus between 30 to 36 minutes. Theater of Pain is already a 37-minute dungeon right now. And then the possible nightmare that could be the new dungeon, Operation Floodgate, that will be added in Season 2. So the outlook right now is of complete desperation. Season 2 will be terrible, players will be quitting. Mythic Plus left and right. We literally yesterday just had a video begging for the removal of the deplete system. So instead, we are still gonna have the deplete system. The dungeons of the War Within that will come in Season 2 will be worse than the ones we have now. And then we have another dungeon now with Theater of Pain, which will be the worst of all of them. Plus the new dungeon added by Blizzard, Operation Floodgate, will be even worse. So total disaster. All is lost, it's over. Okay, Izen, fine, I get it, I get the point, but what if? What if I like the taste of copium? You know, I take out one bottle every night, you know, I stand in front of my PC, I chug down the entire bottle of it. What if we actually were more positive? Well, the positive angle here could be that, of course, these dungeons we have seen as horrifying in Heroic because of how annoying they are, the ones from the War Within, will of course be tuned for Mythic Plus. So we are in line for receiving multiple nerfs to all of these dungeons. So, you know, of course, we might be expecting some major buffs to the Dark Flame Cleft Light mechanic for Mythic Plus, several nerfs to the amount of casts and spam casts and annoyances in the Cinderbrew Meadery, as well as the Priory of the Sacred Flame, especially the second part, once you're inside the Cathedral. Several nerfs there to make the trash mobs especially way more manageable, so that could smoothen out the annoyance of the War Within dungeons. And then you have Theater of Pain, which might be nerfed and adjusted for a more modern Mythic Plus experience. To me, the absolute best option would be to literally forget the Koltaros wing exists. Literally just cut the dungeon from 5 bosses to 4. Cut the timer from, 37 minutes to 30 and call it a day. And then the addition, of course, of the Operation Floodgate new dungeon being a good one. 3 to 4 bosses, big chunky pools with many mobs, not too many annoying casts or too many casts at a time. That can make it more enjoyable. And then we can finish with the cherry on top of the removal of the deplete system, or at the very least, as we mentioned, adding some charges to your keys so that you can fail and try again a few times before depleting the key fully. That could be or would be perhaps the best possible scenario for the new season of Mythic Plus in Season 2. However, of course, the best we can report on for now is of the addition of these 2 dungeons, Mechagon Workshop and Theater of Pain, filling up the 8 slots for the Mythic Plus dungeons in Season 2. The rest will have to, I guess, come from the PTR, and the changes we will see from these dungeons before the actual release of the season. So roughly probably a couple of months minimum before we get to see the release state of all of these dungeons. But for today, I guess we can say it's not looking too good. Right, we are pending positive changes to save us from what awaits us in Season 2 of Mythic Plus. So, for today, on this Sunday, this was the perhaps not so positive announcement. We are now going to be leaving each other to the rest of our weekend. We're starting, of course, the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has also been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, Where are my headphones? Right over here. I need to cut, edit, mount, and send this video.